Okay, all right. Okay, so my approach is to take a look at Greek diplomacy with other powers, and of course the main period that we've been dealing with for 2 days is the Mississippian and on into the colonial interaction with colonial powers, primarily the Spanish, French, and British, and then eventually the Americans. So that's primarily what I'll talk about. I'll bring in archaeology when I can. A lot of this comes from history, from the history written by the colonists. So it's certainly open to question, and we're constantly trying to reevaluate and try to understand it better, what the clues we do have from the written history. But fortunately, there are ways that archaeologists can enlighten us and challenge sometimes the historical documents as well. And so anyway, I'll try to bring that in where I can. Initially, I wanted to just take a look at the entire eastern half of North America. This is a map done maybe 25 years ago by Helen Tanner, who was a great anthropologist, ethnohistorian, who had painted with a broad brush. She looked at the East in a big, expansive way, and she always maintained, a good friend of mine passed away some years ago, but she maintained all her life that people in the past, contrary sometimes to popular opinion, people in the past often traveled great distances. They had the ability to obtain information and news from great distances away in reasonable amounts of time. We're used to instantaneous, and that certainly wasn't the case back then, but in a matter of weeks or months, you would get news of what's happening in Canada or in the Great Plains or in Europe, for that matter. And so there were ways that people coped and managed to communicate over great distances. And so it's something of a conundrum why archaeologists for much of the last century have been very reluctant to acknowledge that. Unless we find some object that we can directly trace to some distant place, we're very reluctant to say that there was any kind of interaction or communication between one location and another. That's a very conservative viewpoint. I think that I know there's been some work in the American Southwest kind of looking at things in the same way, trying to not assume that people don't talk to each other, but actually assume the opposite, and then see where that leads you in your understanding of the past. So that's what Helen was doing here. She just drew some lines connecting major points, kind of nodes on the communication network that existed in the colonial era, and there are thousands of others. We don't need to update at the moment, I don't guess. And she's left some out. There are plenty more now that we could add to her map. The coastal route by canoe was, of course, of huge importance to the coastal people. I work today in Mobile, Alabama, and we know there are connections to Texas and northern Mexico that date way back many thousands of years. And so there's much more you could add to this. This is just the kind of the bare bones of this huge connected set of paths and waterways that people use to move around the region. One thing I want to point out is that this does extend way far to the north, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. We've already discussed the Spanish intrusion into the region, beginning primarily, most significantly with De Soto in 1539-43, that era. But there were continued arrivals of Spaniards along the coast and some intrusions into the interior, as has been mentioned by other speakers. This was there were diplomatic ways of getting along, even with people as brutal as De Soto. I've often viewed his army as a band of trained murderers. They're very efficient murderers, and they practice that art every once in a while. But that was actually probably not a daily event. There were lots of periods in which they extorted food and other resources from their hosts, but by and large they tried to use diplomacy initially in many cases, and the people that they met along the way were also using diplomatic negotiating skills that they had developed on their own. So we don't know a lot about this. There's discussions and various mentions of the Spanish negotiating with various chiefs along the way, but in a lot of ways we don't have a lot of detail of how that actually played out. But certainly it was long periods of diplomatic training on the part of the Mississippian people were put to use, and sometimes very effectively. In some cases, the local people managed to get the Spanish moving relatively rapidly by telling them that their neighbors had much more resources, and so they're using their skills in that way. The maps we have of the region from that period, I will show you a number of maps as I go along here, of the southeast from various perspectives. The initial ones from Spain are pretty much indicate that the Spanish didn't know where they were a good bit of the time. There's really not any coherence to the maps. The descriptions written at the time by members of De Soto's party are much easier to follow, actually, than these maps, which tend to kind of randomly sort the towns out across the landscape. So they're not a particular value, actually, but they do suggest that the Spanish thought of the region as an entity, as a whole. And so this is actually the one on the lower left, that's the first depiction of the Southeast as a geographical region on any European map. As I'll show you in a moment, there are Indian perspectives that are around as well. Archaeologists, as we've heard, have been trying to piece together our own sort of maps of this region based on where town sites are found and when they were and where they are not found in different periods. And this is a view of around 1630 or 40, something like that, that Marvin Smith and others among the southeastern archaeologists have been working on for many years, trying to create really an independent kind of view of what the Southeast looked like in terms of different social groupings and then the regions that were contested between peoples. Then a number of mentions today of Fusachi, the excavations that were done over the 1980s and 90s primarily. And I did want to include that in here. This is a view of some of the domestic dwellings, the homes from the winter type homes of the creeks in the mid 1600s. And this shows on the bottom, it shows the sunken floor of an excavated house. So the archaeologists have excavated out the debris that fell in when that house was abandoned, and the roof collapsed and everything filled in, and then it was excavated. On the top, it's very hard to see, I guess, but there's a dark stain that shows what the house looks like before it was excavated. And from this, we can learn quite a lot about what the house looked like, how it was built, and these are really quite impressive, big, impressive structures. The various kinds of things that have shown up in the archaeological record from this period do show a lot of contact, and so even though it's not necessarily implying a diplomatic relationship between the creeks and the source of the material, which is debated, but I think generally Spanish Florida seems to be the major source of much of the metal, and as I think Marvin mentioned already, the shell is a very ancient kind of material that was traded long distances from the coast to the interior, to the Muskogeans in the interior, and we think that the brass and other kinds of materials that were moving in the same general direction probably flowed along those same sort of human links. And so people who were in the interior would have had established trade connections, of course, with many of the people along the path toward the source of these materials. We don't know that there were Spaniards moving these goods inland. The economics of it seem to be primarily involving in various Indian societies. And so, of course, the relationships between those people are primarily important at that period. And in many ways, from an Indian perspective, from the interior, the Spanish would have been very peripheral to their existence and only occasionally become important to them at different times. So quite a variety of different sorts of goods eventually made it into the interior. The selection of these things was very much in the hands of the native peoples. They decided what they wanted and needed. And although we don't have information like this from this period, a few decades later we know that there were requests made for particular kinds of metal goods or cloth or other kinds of things. There were actually requests written out in quite considerable detail by the Indian peoples asking for certain kinds of things that they preferred and they could use, and they would discard others. So there's a lot of agency there. There's a lot of participation by the native peoples in the whole trade process of material moving inland. All right. There were a few colonial settlements along the coastline early on, primarily in the Spanish region of Georgia, East Florida coast, St. Augustine being the most long-lasting of all of these settlements. But there were others eventually, Pensacola in 1698, and then, of course, many other large Spanish cities to the south, Havana and Veracruz and Mexico City were quite important. We have intriguing mentions in the late 1600s of Creek leaders being invited to visit the royal viceroy in Mexico City. And this happened a number of times. In about 1717, another visit by Creek leaders to Mexico City and to Havana as well. So there were people that were from the interior, from the Muskogean region, traveling great distances to meet with various kinds of colonial leaders. And that pattern continues on through the 18th and 19th centuries as well. Mainly talk about the Spanish during this period, but there was an important French intrusion, another effort by another colonial power to establish a foothold in the southeast. And this took place on the South Carolina coast, of the Atlantic coast. And they didn't last too long. They were immediately opposed by the Spanish. And so at this period, there were a lot of animosities between the French and Spanish in Europe, and that carried over to the situation in the Americas. But they also began to kind of copy the Spanish model. In many ways, the Spaniards figured out how to colonize the world. And they did this in the Philippines and in Africa and all over the world. And most other European powers then simply learned from them. They tried to establish the pattern that the Spanish had found successful, and in many ways were not innovating at all. They were, when they did so, it was often kind of to emphasize one aspect of commerce, for example, that they might excel at. But the whole model really follows the Spanish lead. And there was a lot of information, a lot of spies in Europe trying to intercept messages from the Americas about how the Spanish were getting along and what was working for them and what wasn't. Oh, I should go back for a moment. Okay. Yeah. This image on the lower right, it's the only one I'm aware of that shows the black drink ceremony. And this was in the area of the Timucuans and other people in the kind of northeastern Florida region. But it was something that, of course, all succeeding European colonists who dealt with Indians in a diplomatic fashion would participate in the black drink ceremony as a method of purification that the native peoples had used. And the Europeans often found it much easier to go along with these customs than to try to accommodate these particular traditions already practiced in the Southeast. And of course, today, still a lot of interest in the black drink. All my students always are quite keen on learning about the black drink because of the scientific name, Ilex vomitoria, and the tradition of vomiting as part of the purification ritual is still firmly attached to that plant, the Yaupon plant. Even though there's actually no evidence that the vomiting was caused at all by the ingestion of the black drink. All right. That first French effort to colonize was a pretty abysmal failure. They were almost all the colonists were either wiped out by or killed by the Spanish or taken captive by them and sent back to France. It's a very short-lived experiment. But the French had a long-term interest in this region, primarily because they had established a successful colony in Canada by the early 17th century and very quickly spread throughout the Great Lakes region and down into the Mississippi Valley, mostly trading for furs with Indians in those regions. And as they spread their influence throughout that region, they realized by simply looking at the map of North America that if they could then connect the Gulf Coast with the Canadian holdings, that they could then essentially seal off the English on the East Coast, on the Atlantic coast, and block further English expansion inland. And this is all very European perspective, obviously. There's this tens of thousands of native peoples throughout this region and a few hundred Frenchmen. They weren't in any sense in control of that interior region, but on the maps that the French produced from that period, they claimed the entire region. And so it was all about competing claims between European powers from this European perspective. The second effort really was no more successful than the first. It was launched by LaSalle, who had managed to navigate the length of the Mississippi River. In the 1670s, he went to France to convince the French king, Louis XIV, that he could establish a colony near the mouth of the Mississippi. And when he then managed to sail 3 ships into the Gulf of Mexico, he didn't go to the mouth of the Mississippi. He went to the kind of central Texas coast and set up his colony. And there's been debate ever since as to why he did that. Essentially, I think the general consensus seems to be, well, initially for many decades, it was assumed that he was simply lost. They didn't know where he was, couldn't find the Mississippi, and ended up in Texas. It seems quite implausible, actually, for a number of reasons. And I think consensus seems to be today that he intended to settle as close as he could to Spanish silver mines in the northern area of Mexico. So he was way off from what the original plan was that had been approved by Louis XIV. And again, it was a disaster. Almost within about 3 years, all of the colonists, except I think 4 children, had died. And those 4 were taken back eventually to France to help the third and then successful attempt by the French to set up a colony. So here's a map, a typical European map showing this massive area supposedly controlled by France called La Louisiane, and a little tiny pink area on the east, which is the English area, and then Spanish Florida is actually shown in a little darker green there, and then, of course, Spanish Mexico. And that kind of map continues on today. You know, you see these things still in school books and on the internet, where I pulled this one off. It's just an extremely misleading view. Helen Tanner, my map-making friend from years ago, was so incensed by this sort of thing that she created an entire atlas of the Great Lakes during the colonial period to show native settlements and the very few and gradual infiltration of European colonists into that region. So there are ways to make these maps much more realistic. We're just simply following off on the old colonial model here by using these sort of maps. I did want to show you some native maps of the Southeast. These are really quite rare and still quite amazing to me. I learned about these as a graduate student quite a few years ago now, but they still are extremely intriguing, I think, and there's a huge amount to be learned still by further study of these maps. These 3, the top 2 are by Chickasaw headmen who were dealing with, in one case, the governor of South Carolina. The one on the left was done about 1723. One on the upper right is from about 10 years later. Chickasaw is talking to French officials. And then the one on the lower right is a Catawba map. And they, in general, obviously there's some similarities here. The circle, the social circle, represents different political and social groups of native peoples. Sometimes these correspond to the names that Europeans used at the time. Sometimes they don't. But the various, let's see, this is the Creeks in 1723. This shows Virginia. So in this case, the Chickasaw is considered the Europeans in a similar kind of social sense as a separate people to the east. And then this is the Choctaw Nation, and I'm sorry, that's Chickasaw Nation and Choctaws down here. And this line running through here, that's the major trading path that the English used to go to the Chickasaws, and they had to traverse Creek lands at that time. This one on the lower right's always intrigued me even further. The native peoples are indicated by circles, but in this case they distinguished Virginia here as a square, Europeans being squares, and here's Charleston, the street grid. So, you know, very clear visual distinction between those on that particular map. These maps had all kinds of particular points of view. They're not any more accurate, actually, than European maps. They have their own perspective, their own. In this case, for most of these maps that we have today, the only reason they survive the colonial period is because the governors had received them as part of a diplomatic effort by various Indian peoples to kind of portray themselves in certain ways that they would, basically asking for alliances. In this case, the Chickasaws felt very isolated, and I have a blow up here. This is my redrawing of that 1723 Chickasaw map. showing a lot of other detail here. There's all sorts of small tribes. The French called them petite nations, the small tribes of the lower Tombigbee, Alabama River. Here's the Mississippi River with many other social groups. There's about 50 different native societies shown on this map. Remarkable detail. In the far north, I mentioned how Tanner's map shows this communication network extending over vast regions. Well, this one did as well. This is the Senecas in the far north. They're part of the Iroquois nation up in the New York area. And I think out here the furthest west is somewhere in the Pawnee areas of Kansas. So we have a massive area here. This is like 500,000 square miles that this one headman had cartographic control over. He knew where these various places were in relationship to each other. And very possibly Chickasaws people would run into Chickasaws all over the place. And so they very possibly visited these in relatively regular fashion. So it just shows a considerable, not only cartographic grasp of the region, but also the ability to travel and negotiate your way through many different social groups, which must have been quite taking a lot of skill at that period. All right. So anyway, eventually, the French managed to get a successful colony going by establishing Mobile in 1699, or in the vicinity of Mobile by then. And from then on until 1763, the French are in control of some portion of the Gulf Coast. It's really quite a small area from New Orleans to Mobile, and then a few scattered settlements up into the Mississippi Valley and Natchez eventually. So, and just setting aside that map with the big La Louisiana across there, that's just completely imaginary to a large extent. They did have some very important settlements, though, and one I want to really focus on today, which is the most important to the Muskogee people, was the establishment of Fort Toulouse, which is just north of modern-day Montgomery in the town of Wetumpka today. And this was established in 1717 by the French at the invitation of the Alabamas in particular, but the Creeks as a whole agreed that they could establish a post there. This was after about 28 years of English occupation of a trading house at that location. And I haven't mentioned the English yet, but they're already in the area by the 1680s, trading extensively with the Creek people. And this is an early map claiming that the area is a British map, claiming that the place had been usurped by the French, taken in some kind of underhanded way from the British. And in fact, it was the Creeks who made sure that the English were expelled and the French were allowed to establish a post there. Just a few more details about the French to give you a little context here. This is a map done in 1733, based largely on information from French officers, but also of Indians who were participating in various trading and diplomatic kinds of relationships with the French, informing them about distant locations that the French had not actually visited themselves. It's amazing detail in many areas, lots of native town locations, particularly around the site of Fort Toulouse right here. And I think maybe if you can make out those names, there's quite a few familiar names in that region there. And there are many other maps like this. This is an extremely important area to the French as well as to the Creeks, as I'll explain in a moment. There were various ways that the French tried to establish diplomatic relations with various Indian nations, and this was a very rare document. Most of these things were actually lost at the end of the French and Indian War. When the French were expelled by the British demanded that native peoples trade in the old metals and in this case a commission into the Order of St. Louis in exchange for new British metals. So the British kind of collected up all the French stuff, threw it away, or sent it back to Europe. We don't have those anymore. So it's a very rare thing. This is actually was given to Conestoga, the Cherokee leader, but there are similar things we know that were given to Creek leaders as well. And Barney, I wanted to point out this a swan wing there that he's holding in his hand. So anyway, there are various ways that they were treating with each other. There are, in fact, no treaties, though, which is kind of interesting. It's a distinction between how the French operated and later the English and Americans. There are all kinds of verbal agreements. There are many congresses where native peoples would be invited to visit the governor in New Orleans or Mobile, and there would be big feasts. Presents would be given on both sides. And then an agreement would be reached, but there would be nothing actually in writing. It was all verbal, which is much more in attune to the native way of doing things. So the French were pretty famous, actually, for trying to incorporate various native modes of discourse into their style of colonizing. Once the fort was established at Fort Sluis and many other posts like it, a lot of active trade between native peoples throughout the Southeast, and these are typical sorts of artifacts that we can attribute to the French. They had their own sources in Europe to supply themselves with beads and cloth and other kinds of materials, and they made their own guns, specifically for the trade to Indian peoples. So these things are quite distinctive, and and in fact, not only we know where they came from, but I think it's quite certain that everybody would have, when they would have seen a gun made by the French, they would have recognized it, because the styles were just radically different from the English type guns. And that's true of, I think, all these categories of goods, which has some importance, as I'll mention in a moment. And then there were a great many other native peoples in the region. The area around Mobile is incredibly complicated, about 15 different small nations, Indian nations, right in the Mobile vicinity, plus the huge Creek population and Choctaw population to the north. So very complicated area diplomatically for all parties involved. And one outcome of that was the use of various kinds of languages, kind of what were often called pidgin jargons, simplified languages that people developed to be able to get along with a fairly small vocabulary, fairly complicated grammar sometimes. So Mobilian in particular is famous from this period as being a way of communicating between many different people speaking different languages. Of course, the other major ceremony mentioned by the French in particular was the Calumet ceremony, which archaeologists today largely view as a form of an adoption ceremony, so that when two peoples would meet on a path in the forest, you could establish relationships, try to find, even if you were related to each other, then all is well, but if you weren't, you could establish one for that temporary purpose of meeting and getting along peacefully and not having to battle it out right there on the path. So the Calumet pipe was extensively used throughout this region, and these are occasionally found archaeologically as well. One thing we found at the site of Mobile during our excavations was the creation by the French of Calumet pipes themselves. This is a native style of pipe, but in this case the French found them so useful that they obtained the stone from Minnesota and actually carved their own right there in Mobile. Another kind of pipe has turned up fairly recently in the Southeast. We didn't know about these even being here, but this is largely a Canadian style pipe. It was created mostly by French Canadians, and it's called the Micmac pipe, Micmac style pipe. So Micmacs are people in Nova Scotia, and they really don't have anything to do with the pipe. It's a misnomer, but anyway, we do have some of these pipes that now have turned up in the Great Lakes, particularly, and then even further south on the Gulf Coast. And so far as I know, we haven't found them yet in the creek area, but it's probably because we haven't really looked for them, and they may well be there. But these particular ones, this one in particular has Jesuit symbol inscribed into the end there, and there seems to be a correlation between native peoples who adopted Catholicism, and they then would smoke this pipe and be able to visually actually show their identification with Christianity, which in many groups became the norm. The Illinois, for example, had large numbers of converts to Christianity. So we're beginning to look for that in other parts of the Southeast. Okay, so then the final group then I wanted to mention is the British, of course, and in this case, this is essentially the same region as shown on the French map, labeled La Louisiane. Here they've labeled it Georgia. It's simply the British perspective on things, and again, I guess to a lesser extent on this one, the Indians are shown here, and there's Upper Creek, Middle Creek, Lower Creek labels on this particular map in that region. But still, the Georgia overlay is what's important to the Europeans at that period. One thing that's interested me for a very long time is how the French and British interacted in the Creek region, and of course then how the Creeks managed to use that to their advantage. And this idea of the playoff system has actually been around since at least the 1960s. And David Corcoran, in a very important book on Creek history, wrote about that and made a good case for it back then as being not only of economic advantage to the Creeks, but also politically advantageous in a geopolitical sense. And I've come to think since then that, in fact, that is probably the most important part of it, that the economics, it maybe was more visible, certainly to archaeologists, but that the political intrigue, really, that went on in the Southeast during the 18th century absolutely depended, from the Creek perspective, on the existence of both the French and the British in the area. And even though, if you look at it from the British perspective, there are always far more British colonists on the East Coast, a few thousand French at the most in Louisiana, tens of thousands in Georgia and South Carolina. And so the French could have easily been pushed out of the picture by the British if they'd had their way. And in fact, they wanted to do just that. But they never succeeded. And it was because the Creeks insisted that the French presence remain. And the way this played out, apparently, according to the historical records, and still is kind of sketchy to a lot of us, but it looks like in 1715, at the outbreak of the Yamasee War, that this was really, in effect, an attempt to expel the British, at least temporarily, from the Southeast. There were several hundred British traders killed during the Yamasee War, and the Yamasees were closely allied with the Creeks during this period. The Creeks participated in this war against the British. And the reason they did that, there's quite a few reasons, but I think most persuasively, there had been a whole series of slaving wars that the British had instigated against various small eastern tribes of Indians. And over a period from about 1650 to 1715, in these wars, the British would systematically use one group as a source of slaves, primarily from people further west. So the Choctaws and Creeks occasionally were raided for slaves, which would then be sold in the markets of Charleston, South Carolina. And these small groups that had participated in that trade, one after another, were destroyed in a series of wars that the British instigated against them. And in fact, what they did was they would attack that group, enslave them, and then move another group into the picture and have them work as a middleman until they enslaved them. And after a few years of this, all the people in the Southeast, all the native people in the Southeast, realized that this was the pattern. And essentially, the Yamasees realized they were going to be next. And so they kind of preemptively organized this big uprising against British traders in which the Creeks participated. At the end of that war, there was this vacuum in the Southeast, really no French, no British traders in the Creek region for a couple of years. And it was during that time there was intense negotiations between the British and Spanish and French trying to regain access to the Creek nation. And we don't know very much about what all went on. That was one of the times when Creek leaders were taken to Mexico City to try to impress them about joining in alliance with the Spanish. But eventually, and according to the records we have, it looks like primarily attributed to Emperor Brims of Coweta, but it's probably actually a much broader understanding reached among Creek leaders that no one power would ever have complete control in that region again, over trade, but in other ways as well. And so what they did essentially was invite the French to establish Fort Toulouse, invite the British to come back into neighboring towns, but then open trade broadly to everybody. And the way this plays out archaeologically is that there are various factions visible within the Creek nation at this point forward. Some primarily using French goods, so French guns, French buckles and pipes and all sorts of things that are attributed to the French. We can recognize these. And other things that are coming from English sources. And when we look at this archaeologically in the Tallapoosa River Valley, we see that there are towns with both French and British artifacts over the entire length of the Tallapoosa Valley. So Fort Toulouse is over here, and all these other towns have both kinds of goods in use during this critical period, 1717 to 1763. And this continues right up to the end of the French occupation. When the French leave, of course, then the Creeks no longer have that ability to play off the two parties, and they're forced to be more creative, really, at that point, and they bring in the Spanish from further west in Louisiana. It becomes much more difficult for them, but they managed to do this for a century, essentially, almost right up to the Creek War. So 1717 to about 1813, this system works remarkably well. And Alexander McGillivray managed to do this by playing off between the Americans and the Spanish and the English to some extent as well. So it's a really tried and true system. It couldn't have been done, though, by just a single person, whether it's Emperor Brims or Alexander McGillivray, deciding that that's how this is going to work. It required the cooperation of essentially all the Creeks to not necessarily like the French or like the British, but to tolerate the people who were wanting to trade with one group or the other. And so it's this tolerance of various factions and allowing everybody to maintain peaceful relations with one group or another and not fight between themselves. That really was the key diplomatic maneuver of the 18th century. The Choctaws tried to do something similar, and they were not geographically positioned to be able to do that. They ended up fighting each other, and the English faction lost very badly. And because the French were much stronger, they were much closer to the Choctaws, were able to persuade the Choctaws not to allow this kind of neutrality of factionalism that existed among the Creeks. The only other group that successfully managed to do this is the Iroquois, far to the north. And as I've kind of implied, we know there were connections between the Iroquois and the Creeks. And in 1701, the Iroquois worked out a similar kind of arrangement with their neighbors and with the French and British in the far north. So I'm pretty certain that there were connections between these groups here. All right, so various kinds of accoutrements show affiliation very obviously with the British, all kinds of things with British symbolism. A lot of indication of this transition, as a number of speakers today have talked about, this transition to the market economy that was kind of a global in scale, this transition to use of cloth in place of leather, guns in the place of bows and arrows. It was a kind of a gradual process, but it certainly had a huge impact in the long run. I wanted to just briefly show these various Creek leaders who went to Europe at various occasions. The most famous, I think, 1733-34, when some of the Georgia Creeks went to London. And there's a great painting done at the time. They're showing them the entire delegation, Mary Musgrove among them, over there on the far right. Many kinds of meetings in the various colonial capitals, such as St. Augustine, Charleston, Mobile. This is a powder horn done in the 1760s of a conference between the Creeks and the governor of Georgia, or I'm sorry, governor of East Florida, a place called Piccolata. And well, anyway, lots of other travels throughout the region that we won't go into here. There were kind of elements of economy that have really not been explored very much by archaeologists yet. A lot of focus on the trade goods from colonial sources, but there are all sorts of things being made by native peoples for trade to the Europeans, and particularly various kinds of copies of pottery show up in large quantities on colonial plantations throughout the South. This is a much more accurate, I think, view of the Southeast than we've ever seen before. It's something that the folks at Alabama Department of Archives and History put together just a few months ago, based primarily on a series of British maps drawn in the 1770s. And essentially, the European settlements are just right along the coast. That's the border that the British established between their settlements and between the Indian nations at that time. And the red dots out here are the various towns of the Choctaws, Creeks, Cherokees, and Chickasaws, and Seminole. There's a few Seminole towns down in there as well. So we're beginning to be able to get a more realistic view of settlement at that period. I want to really briefly show square grounds here. They're something that I'm quite interested in is how the square grounds were used in the 18th century. Fusacci excavation view shows a few square ground buildings here. They're only partially shown here. It's based on posts left in the ground. It's a set of 3 there, and these are probably earlier ones running down here to this region. And these are the large council houses, the winter council houses, a whole sequence of them across the site there. So there's really a lot to be learned about the changing architecture of those buildings through time, the places where diplomacy occurred, really in the Creek towns. And of course, the later negotiations with the Americans began with the Treaty of New York, based on on British models of how to negotiate with Indian peoples. And of course, this treaty is actually quite influential. For one reason, there was a secret agreement worked out between Alexander McGillivray and the negotiators for Washington that allowed various and paid for various Creek boys to go to live with the Quakers, primarily in Philadelphia, for schooling. And quite a few influential Creeks from the early 19th century participated in that secret treaty program. And one last thing I wanted to show is, again, the maps just continue to show the same kind of thing, this time with an American overlay. But one thing that's becomes increasingly problematic for the Creeks during these later negotiations with the Americans is that they don't have as much leverage as they had earlier on. And one item in particular, the access across the Creek Nation to reach New Orleans from the east, once the Louisiana Purchase had been formed. There was this need to move troops. The U.S. felt they had to get the mail and troops across the Creek Nation quickly. And so they demanded, really, the creation of a road. And that's what this is. It's shown here being constructed in 1812. It's called the Federal Road. And that's when negotiations really began to fail, I think, between the Creeks and the old factions, really permanently separated right before the Creek War. And I believe the Creek War is largely the failure of the old Emperor Brim's McGillivray model of how to deal with Europeans with so few options left. They weren't able to maintain this unity they had within the nation up to that point. So this is some interesting artifacts from Josiah Francis Hillis-Haya from the British Museum, one of the Red Stick leaders. And then one last slide just showing Creeks on the coast. Creeks had been largely an inland people until the Creek War, and then at that point they began to establish settlements in the south, and that's, of course, the formation of some of the Seminole towns is actually Creek towns moving down to the coast. So we have various archaeological sites and various historical information from that period along the Gulf Coast. So that's essentially my presentation. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
So it was not until the 19th century that the Creeks began moving further south, like into Florida? Were there other tribes?
Right.
People
Yes, there were quite a number of people along the Gulf Coast up until 1763, the Mobilians and the Tomes and other groups like that, some of whom left when the French left. A lot of French didn't go back to France. Most of them went west of the Mississippi River, and so the Mobilians and other groups joined them. The Alabamas around Fort Salus went there as well. And so it kind of left an opening, and both Choctaws and Creeks moved south at that point. It's been a long 2 days. There's one down here.
Do you know when the Indians been given the white man's names, Caucasian names?
Yeah, right. Well, people like Josiah Francis had, I don't know very much about his background, but he's thought to have had a French father. And so frequently in those cases they would have both European and Indian names. And whether or not those were written down is often our problem. We don't always know the alternative name. Another one, I think.
We hear the names of McIntosh, McGillivray,
Right.
McCurtain. Those Scottish names in particular, were they more common? Were there more of the Scottish that came into the Creek Nation then?
Yeah, a lot of the traders were Scots, and they had after 1745, a lot of Highland Scots had to leave Scotland, and so many of them came to South Carolina and Georgia. Whole clans moved in some cases, and so some of the major trade companies were set up by Scots, and so they tended to hire Scots, and so they ended up with large numbers of them in the Creek Nation.